Hiya.
Hey, you okay?
Not bad, thank you.
Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Awesome. Okay, we'll just give it a minute and then
Yeah.
we'll get started. Um, cool. Do you want to just drop in the comment? There you go.
Yeah,
Awesome.
all done.
Before we get started, for those who are hard of hearing, there will be a caption video later this week. And for those who are visually impaired, just going to give a quick visual description. I'm Josh, this is my voice, and I'm a Caucasian 22-year-old male, blonde hair, blue eyes, wearing a blue t-shirt.
And my name is Lucy. I am a Caucasian female presenting girl with brown hair, blue eyes, wearing a grey t-shirt.
Cool. So this is just us covering some of the outcomes of COP. Hopefully trying to make sense of everything and really judging how the UK presidency went. Just a disclaimer, we will not cover everything. There's so much to go into it. However, we're just going to go over a few key points, and then just in general, this is from our perspective as two people from the UK, from the global north, and there will be more content coming out later this week from hopefully getting some more global perspectives of what has gone on. Okay, cool. So how are you feeling, Lucy, after these past 2 weeks?
I'm good. I'm kind of exhausted. I treated myself to a spa day today to relax after it all, which is so bougie, but yeah, no, it's feeling good now that I'm back home and rested up a little bit. How about you? How are you feeling?
Not bad. I had a big Sunday roast today, so I'm like ready to go again with it, whatever comes next. All
Lovely.
right. So, okay, so let's just start with basics. Just remind us of the context. What is COP? What is the UNFCCC? What is all this jargon that's flying around, and why does this one matter?
So a COP stands for Conference of Parties. It's a meeting that takes place every year, usually in the winter time, and it's ran by the UNFCCC, which is just a long way of essentially saying UN climate change. Um, and it's given so much attention this time because these COPs have been going on for 27 years. Governments have been meeting at the COP, and uh, it's been building up to a point where obviously action has to be taken now. And so this is now 5 years on from the Paris Agreement. It was the time for the global stocktake, which essentially just means like a reflection on where we're at and how we can move forward. And so it was seen as like a big turning point for where action could actually um, really push us into a more progressive future for climate action. Do you have anything to add, Josh?
I don't know. I think the fact that it's been 2 years as well in the UK, it seemed more relevant because it was in this country, and obviously our media is obsessed with ourselves. Um, so I think there's also this pressure. In the past 3 years, we had the Fridays for the Future movement really come out of the roots. We've had XR to also put pressure on, and we had scientists kind of saying that we've only got till 2030 to reduce our emissions nearly in half to stand a chance of keeping 1.5, which we'll get on to later. So I guess the UK has the presidency, and the UK government is going to set itself some goals to do with this. So what was it hoping really to achieve at this conference?
So there were a number of goals that the presidency had, but the kind of central ones that it seemed to set out a path for before the COP included so ending coal, ending deforestation, transitioning to electric vehicles, achieving international finance goals, and keeping 1.5 alive. So keeping the 1.5 degree targets out from the IPCC report alive. And you may have seen in the news, obviously, there was quite a big focus on coal in the last few days. Josh, do you want to fill us in on what went down? All the tea?
Okay, so in short, basically, they managed to get into the text. So let's get some context first. So we've had nearly 30 years of these climate negotiations, and never once in any of these negotiations, official documents, has coal, fossil fuels ever really been mentioned. which is surprising given it's quite a big source of climate change and another one problem which we need to get rid of. So when the first draft text came out, it was a big hurrah for everyone that there was a mention of phasing out coal and that we were going to end fossil fuel subsidies. So those when the government basically pays fossil fuel companies to help make fossil fuel energy cheaper for everybody, but also involves promoting the use of fossil fuels. So they had this language that we're going to phase out, which was really, really good. That got watered down to basically we're going to phase down and that we're going to end inefficient use of fossil fuels. So we had these two loopholes introduced, which is interesting because it means that countries don't feel like it could be a get out of jail free card essentially from the UK presidency really achieving this goal, and not quite what they hoped for. Who was really fighting for this coal to get taken out, to phase out, and who is really the one who put it to phase down?
So I think that there was a big push from the presidency itself to try and phase out coal. I think it was an easy goal for the UK to try to push forward because we don't really use coal that much anymore anyway. So, we don't really have to phase out as such. We already kind of have. But on Friday night, just as the draft text, as Josh said, included phase out unabated coal emissions, India was the country that intervened and tried to, succeeded in watering it down to phase down. India has come under quite a lot of scrutiny this COP, but could see it that they've been a bit of a scapegoat for some of the other big polluters like the US and the UK. And but India were the one that changed the wording in the final draft. And the inefficient use of fossil fuel subsidies, I'm not sure who changed that one, but inefficient was actually pushed by global south countries who were trying to highlight that if they were to stop fossil fuel subsidies in some of their poorest communities, then that could raise their electricity prices by a considerable amount for the poorest in their country. So it's supposed to be a just addition, the inefficient use of fossil fuel subsidies, but as Josh says, it will just be whether richer nations try to spin that and try to justify their own fossil fuel subsidies by using that language. But yeah, so Josh, do you have anything to add on that? Like, can you think of any other countries that were kind of pitching in on this?
I think what's important to note is obviously India got a lot of blame. It was India who made the final intervention in the big plenary. It was quite a dramatic moment, but they did make the argument, and I think it's quite a reasonable argument, and one based on like climate justice, is that their developing country, their large population, who is not really responsible for historical emissions, it is the global north countries like the UK, the US. I think there's 23 countries, developed countries, responsible for 50% of all emissions, representing only 12% of the world population. So they have a right to use up more of what's left of our carbon budget, and actually it should be countries like the US who should really be leading on ending fossil fuels. However, it seems that they were also kind of complicit in this phasing down, and it does make sense. The US has this habit of being like, we're going to be a big climate leader, and then domestically in their own country and then behind closed doors in these negotiations, they're kind of acting a bit differently. President Biden has had a lot of trouble getting his climate change agenda through Congress, with some Democratic senators such as Joe Manchin not pushing back on that because they represent coal country. And then also you've got the fact that he is delaying on stopping things like it's Line 3, which is another oil pipeline which is being built through America. So India's getting this blame for ending coal. However, I wouldn't just I'd take it all with a pinch of salt, essentially.
Yeah, definitely. Especially considering like when you look at emissions per capita, I think it's like 1.8 for India, whereas it's like 15.5 for America. So it just shows kind of this like scale difference between like the wide use and consumption of fossil fuels in America rather than India. But yeah, so but another key target was deforestation. This was another kind of early announcement that we saw from the World Leaders Summit at the beginning of the COP. And what was agreed was essentially a number of countries signed on to end deforestation by 2030. And there were some surprise sign-ups. Brazil signed on, which has obviously caught the media's attention because there's been such a focus on Amazon deforestation in recent years, but so did Indonesia, who's also has, some of the largest rainforests in the world. So did the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has obviously the Congo Basin. So it was promising to see some of these countries that house like some of the world's largest carbon sinks, some of the world's largest sources of biodiversity signing up to this agreement. However, do you know what countries didn't sign up, Josh? Because I know that there were some that didn't make it on.
I can't remember from the top of my head. I think what stuck out for me with this was one, not all countries did sign up, which is unusual. The UNFCCC process is they try and do things by consensus. So they get every country involved. Climate change is a global issue and therefore we need to act globally. There's 100 plus odd countries and there's 197 parties in the whole process. And also this 2030 deadline, we know we have to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030, and yet they're still happy for deforestation to happen until 2030. It could in general be a bit more ambitious, and obviously we're all talking about promises, blah blah blah. We kind of want more concrete action now, and we want action globally, not just from a select few.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, definitely. Delayism is the new denialism. So all of these just dates that are like decades off, it doesn't really help us in the present moment. But kind of another an announcement that kind of was a bit more of a miss compared to the deforestation one was definitely the electric vehicles. So the announcement that countries would sign up to transition to all electric cars and vans by 2035 in leading markets, 2040 in kind of emerging markets or developing countries, was signed up to by a number of countries, excluding the 4 largest car manufacturers in the world, so the US, China, France and Germany. So it's kind of made it slightly redundant that a bunch of countries were signing up, but not the ones that actually produce all the world's cars. And so because these governments refused to sign up, so then did some of the world's biggest car manufacturers like Toyota, Honda, BMW. And so that's a very large portion of the world's like transport market actually not signing up to this massive agreement. So that was a bit of a miss for the COP presidency, certainly. Yeah. Josh, do you want to talk more about kind of the finance commitments that the presidency were hoping to get out of the COP?
Yeah, so with international finance, back in 2009, it was agreed at one of these COPs that developed countries would support developing countries in transitioning their economies and adapting to climate change at the tune of about $100 billion worth of investment per year by 2020. However, countries have fallen short of this mark. It was 80 billion in 2019, and now recent commitments suggest that it's going to be 2023 until we hit this 100 billion. And obviously this is quite controversial because this was a big promise by developed countries to developing countries. Obviously developing countries still have to be somewhat reliant on fossil fuels. That is debatable how reliant, but there is a reliance in there, more so than what developed countries are. And this finance is part of making this transition more just and equitable across the globe. The 100 billion in itself is controversial as well because it was agreed 12 years ago now. They've still not hit the target. They said by 2025 they're going to make up the difference for what they missed. But this was a target agreed 12 years ago. We've had inflation, we've had a pandemic since, and we had a lot more runaway climate change than we expected. It's been worse than what we've expected to this point. So therefore, this 100 billion figure in general, even if they reach it, is questionable whether it's actually really enough. And I think this is going to be something that keeps coming up year after year after year after year. So the next big one, I think, is there anything else you want to add on to finance? Sorry, before we move on.
No, not that I can think think of. I'm sure we can come back to it later when we kind of talk about like the other things that, as you say, are like missed off of the agenda. But yeah, the other obviously like the issue with the finance is that it really strains the trust between global south and global north countries, which is already highly strained within these negotiations. So it's, you know, by global north countries not providing that funding, global south then don't trust that they're actually going to like follow their actions. And so that then brings us on to like the big one, which is the 1.5-degree targets and whether countries feel like they're going to make it or not. So at the moment, obviously the key thing that a lot of young people were calling for was like keeping 1.5 alive. So making targets that actually keep us on track to only reach 1.5 degrees of warming this century.
1 second.
Um,
To give context, 1.5
yeah.
is the target government set themselves in the Paris Agreement, and it's also the target agreed by a lot of scientists that after that, between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, that we could expect to see runaway climate change, very, very disastrous effects all around the world, especially in developing countries. And therefore, this is a target we really, really must stay below. It's also important to note that there's a lot of bad climate change already happening, so this 1.5 is really should be an upper limit. But that's just the context there, sorry.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. So yeah, as Josh said, we kind of want to keep it below this target, and to do so, the IPCC, which is the COP's kind of scientific body, said that we need to decrease our emissions by 45% by 2030. Surprise, surprise, we are not currently doing so. At the moment, from the targets that were at this COP, we're currently expected to see a 13% rise in emissions by 2030. So way off of where we need to be, and that amounts to about 2.4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. So this was a big swing and a miss by the COP presidency, because they were really trying to, I think, call on governments to ratchet up their targets, so, you know, increase their targets, make them more ambitious. And that obviously did not happen. So instead, what happened was that in the final text, they've essentially requested that governments update their targets ahead of Egypt next year, COP27, which will take place next November or December, to keep them in line with 1.5 degrees. So this is how the government are saying that they've kept 1.5 alive, when really we're at 2.4. So yeah, Josh, what do you think of this? Do you think that that's actually keeping 1.5 alive? Do you believe that they're going to be able to do that?
I think the government has a lot of tongue in cheek if they're going to say they've kept 1.5 alive. They're really heavily reliant on they've changed the word from urges countries to come back to request countries to come back, when there's a lot of like Twitter debate over what is stronger, urges or requests, and it's very like legally jargony. I think it just shifts the pressure onto COP27, and we just keep on seeing this that it becomes, well, next year will be the thing we decide on, it'll be next year we decide on, and we're just running out of time at the end of the day. 2.4 degrees of warming is actually an improvement compared to what we were on before, so we can at least give them that. It was closer to 3 degrees. And we've had much more nationally determined contributions, which is what in Paris Agreement countries signed up to be like, well, we're going to each come with what we think we can contribute to helping fight climate change. And we just want these NDCs to be stronger, and for there to be solid plans on how countries actually can achieve these NDCs, because some of these plans might be full of loopholes, little actual missing parts, and dodgy carbon accounting.
Exactly. Yeah, like some of them could, as we say, like this is only a target, it's only a plan. Like, you know, what I'm really worried about is that they can put this plan in, and yeah, that okay, the numbers may add up that they could get to those emissions by 2030, but it's whether then they actually put that plan into action, is whether that actually happens. And as you say, it's whether it's full of like offsets and yeah, dodgy accounting that means that they're still kind of putting the onus on other countries rather than taking it on themselves. So
yeah, there's a lot of talk in the conference about like a carbon market, and there's a lot of talk around the carbon over whether net zero is actually the goal we want to be striving towards, which could be a whole separate discussion in itself. So I think we'll just like say, is 1.5 kept alive? That everyone's saying it's on life support, I think is quite appropriate.
yeah.
Okay, so we talked about the presidency goals. We talked about how altogether the UK presidency has given themselves something they can kind of claim an achievement on towards each goal, but it always comes with a but. So we're going to have to see. So, okay, what was missing really from the government's goals altogether? What was missing from the UK's presidency goals that actually really could have made this a much more successful COP in our eyes for climate justice?
So I think one of the key ones that we saw at the conference was definitely loss and damage. Loss and damage is something that global South nations and civil society have really pushed for really heavily for a long time. But it's never really been pushed onto the central table. Like, it's often been seen as a bit of a niche conversation going on between those kind of constituencies, and the global North countries never really took it seriously. And loss and damage is essentially just talking about the impacts that are already being felt by countries in the global South, marginalized communities, those on the front lines already, so wildfires, floods, rising seas, etc. That is already happening now, so because of the current levels of warming. But at this conference, it actually moved far more into like the central agenda than I think the UK anticipated it would, and I think other global North countries anticipated it would. It became a real sticking point for like the global South countries, who were trying to call for not only the finance that they'd been promised, as Joss was talking about in, back in 2009, but also all the extra finance that they need to be able to actually recover from, the impacts that are already hitting them, and be able to recover in the wake of a pandemic as well, and have some form of justice in these talks. There was a lot of more talk in the civil society space about reparations, about this being the money that these countries are not. It's not aid, it's what they're owed. It's a debt that is, owed to these countries. And so that was definitely missing from the UK government's goals altogether. But Global South and civil society definitely worked hard to push it onto the central table. And what we actually saw was that for the first time in the text, there was definitely a more expanded discussion about loss and damage. It was also the first £2 million worth of funding that went towards it from Scotland, which is the first funding that's ever been put towards it, but it's literal pennies. I think people estimate that it's like trillions that's needed for loss and damage. Germany spent 35 billion recovering from their floods this summer, and that's one set of floods. So if you think of loss and damage all around the world, it's just nothing.
I think that's an important point to make as well, and maybe why it's creeping up the agenda, is loss and damage were, as I've seen for a long time, exclusively unique to developing countries, those on the front lines, such like the Maldives or Pacific Island countries. But actually, loss and damage affects all of us at the end of the day. If there's a flood in Germany and a baker loses the bakery they've been working on for all their life, I don't think any amount of financial compensation right there and then will actually fully repay them for what they have lost. And I think it's much more than just about the actual financial figure. There's a question about cultures. There's a question about home and security and stuff like that. And I think loss and damage, the more climate change goes on, this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue, and more people are going to lose that we can't ever financially repay. And I think that's why it's going to become a bigger and bigger agenda.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as we've been seeing like the wildfires in Australia and California, it's definitely global North is also feeling the impacts now. So even if it's the loss and damage funding isn't intended to go to those countries, I think those countries have a greater awareness that oh shit, it's here. They these global South countries weren't lying when they said that it's really going to impact all communities. But what else do you think was missing from the UK government's goals? Do you think that they done enough to kick out polluters from the COP? Because obviously that was a bit of controversy in the second week.
So with kicking out polluters, there's been polluters present at every single COP, and it's like having big tobacco present at a World Health Summit. It's not really their place to be there, and they're going to bend the conversation in their interest, so that they can keep their money, so that they can keep polluting, and they don't have to take responsibility for the damage that they have already done. So there was a lot of push from civil society, a big call out to Glasgow kick out polluters, who we met in COP, and I was surprised that they were just a small team because they've done some incredible work in just 2 years, and actually kind of helped lead the charge on getting the government to eventually officially not have fossil fuel representatives or platform fossil fuel representatives in the COP in the blue zone where the actual negotiations take place. However, we know that actually over 500 fossil fuel representatives delegation was there. That's a scale of, for context, that's 12 times the amount, I think, of indigenous groups, was it?
Yeah.
Which is crazy, given that
Yeah.
indigenous groups represent 5% of the world population, yet they protect 80% of the world's biodiversity loss. They should be at the forefront of these conversations, and that's representation access we'll talk about in a second. But it's just absolutely bonkers that this is the first COP where we had an official kicking out of polluters, and yet they're still there.
Yeah. And you can almost say that, like, at least when they were sponsors, you could see them, whereas when they're delegates and it's not very transparent, you don't know who they are. It was only because someone done, some very in-depth investigative journalism, so that you can actually see who these polluters are and understand how they're impacting the talk. So it's like two steps forward, one step back, because they're no longer associated with kind of the optics of COP, but you still can't actually pinpoint how they're affecting the negotiations and what strings that they're trying to pull. So yeah.
And they know this space well. They know it better than
Mm-hmm.
youth, because obviously we're young, we're still learning about the world. They know it better than indigenous groups have had to fight to be represented. They know this space like the back of their hand. They think they own this space, and that's essentially what the problem is. And this is why I think it's also going to be a long-running theme. Everyone was like, this is going to be the last big COP or whatever. No, every COP is going to be a big COP from now on. Talking of which, other topics which I think were really pushed into the agenda, not by the UK government, was adaptation finance, which is also linked to loss and damage. Adaptation is basically how could people and countries and societies change their behaviours to adapt to the effects of climate change. So this could be as small as when it was the heat waves back in the summer, you might have gone out and bought a fan, and that in itself is an adaptation that you didn't even realise that you did, and you might not have bought that fan otherwise if it wasn't as hot or intense a heat wave. And adaptation finance, this 100 billion that governments have been promised, it's a bit controversial how much goes to adaptation, how much goes to mitigation. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so in the original target, I think it was 20 billion of the 100 billion was promised towards adaptation, which Global South countries says is nowhere near enough, understandably, because it's in the hundreds of billions, if not trillions, that's needed to help countries actually properly adapt to climate change. So 20 billion is just nothing. And as you were saying, that was 12 years ago. 20 billion now isn't the same as it was then. So it was another big sticking point for Global South countries was ensuring that the balance in the final text wasn't all on mitigation, which is something that obviously the Global North countries don't care about, and was also looking at adaptation as well, which obviously is far more of an issue that affects the Global South. Sorry, Josh, what were you going to say?
I was about to say, Global South countries actually got a bit of a win on this one, didn't they?
Yeah.
Because they're able to get into the text itself that they're going to at least double adaptation finance, and hopefully get it up towards that 50%. Obviously, that won't be quite that 50%, but that's an improvement.
Yeah, definitely. But it's, again, like, if they don't improve on the 100 billion target, it's still double of a target that's too small. So I think they did manage to get into the text like a recognition that adaptation needs to be like, as hi Sophia, and I just saw Katie as well. Love you too, Katie. That there is a greater recognition for adaptation within the COP, and it is being given kind of the airtime and the funding that it is required, but it is still underfunded. It's still not being seen. It's still being seen as aid, which is the completely wrong framing for it, and it still continues to need more pushing forward in the agenda.
I think adaptation and like loss and damage, these topics are quite big topics to handle, and something I think governments, global north governments, have been avoided because it starts to get entangled with really long-running trends in our global economy and concepts like colonialism and neo-colonialism, which essentially is suggesting that the colonial era never really ended, and the whilst states may be southern global south states and former colonies may be independent, they're not really fully independent because they're still entangled in an economic system globally in which developed countries dominate, and then therefore they can bully them into doing basically what they want. And one way is like debt. So global south countries constantly are needing to seek financial debt, so financial loans in order to help develop from global north countries, and that obviously gets added to their international debt. And really loss and damage is reframing it to be like, well, no, actually the debt is reversed, it should be the other way around. And this is quite a hard thing for developed countries to admit to, because if they admit to it, you start to think, well, what about slavery? Well, what about the other damages through colonization that has never been repaid? So it becomes a bigger topic, and you start to expand out the picture beyond climate change. You really start to see how climate change is actually really linked to these long running trends in our economy, in our whole global politics that have been going for over 500 years. So it's a big thing.
Yeah, and that's why, as you say, like global north countries are so terrified to put funding towards it. You know, they've gone as far as acknowledging that it needs attention, but they won't, you know, they're terrified to put funding towards it because as soon as they do, countries like the US, the UK will be completely opened up, and it's then, you know, they're then seen as being exposed to claims for damages and claims for reparations, as you say, across a wide spectrum of issues far beyond climate change. So I think global north countries fear that loss and damage will make them very vulnerable, and it will actually make them finally accountable, and that's why they're so terrified to look at those issues of adaptation and loss and damage more closely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this feels like there's a lot which wasn't quite on the UK presidency's agenda and was put in by global south countries and civil society, and so perhaps, and even by indigenous groups, and perhaps maybe that leads us on to the next thing about access in general to this COP. Who was welcomed into the space and who wasn't welcomed into the space? We know polluters were not welcomed officially, but they were kind of welcomed. Do you know a bit more about that?
So definitely, I mean, I know that there was a push before to kind of, you know, get vaccines to activists that you know, were wishing to come to visit the COP, or the delegates. However, it was definitely, the representation was definitely more global north heavy, European heavy, US heavy. And there was a big disappointment, I think, among civil society that there wasn't greater access for activists from around the world. And there also, once you arrived at Glasgow, there were so many police everywhere that it was a really quite hostile atmosphere. Like, it was a very threatening presence, just police lining every single street, every street corner. There was just huddles of them everywhere. And so even if you are an international activist that made it over here, it's not a very lovely sight when you turn up and there's just yellow high vises everywhere. So I think that access was a key issue of this COP, and it's one that I think will just continue when we go into Egypt, UAE, you know, making sure that civil society there and can be seen. What was your experience of it at the COP?
I think everything you said. Additionally, on top of that, I think once even those who did get to Glasgow, like you said, they were intimidated by the police or whatever. There's a question of who was able to get into the blue zone and what spaces inside the blue zone that I had to get into. Reportedly, there was a lot of negotiation spaces which usually they could get into, and COVID became a convenient experience to not have observers in there. Observers being like civil society, NGOs, for example, those who'd be really interested in finding out what bullshittery is going on within the governments and what they're trying to sneak into the text that they don't want us to know about. So I think that's really, really important. I think as well, what became apparent to me is even those from the Global South, even those from constituencies such as youth, access and disabilities, when they were the ones who got into the space were the privileged ones out of that group. And I think that's also an important conversation to talk about is we have these representative groups, and even when they're fully allowed to interact inside the negotiation spaces they should do, my mum's just joined and it's rather distracted me.
Hi, Josh's mum.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, even when it's what perspectives they bring to this space, you know, and it seemed to me that there were certain voices which the COP presidency, run by a Conservative government, would actually conveniently not have in there. There's youth voices, but what youth voices are getting into that space? And I think that's another thing we should be focusing on, is ensuring that access is a huge thing, because without representation, then these negotiations are not going to envision the full human population, the full globe, and not going to be the best solution to this global problem.
Exactly. Yeah, like there was even when Rishi Sunak done his speech, when, you know, Chancellor of the Exchequer came and to do his speech on the new climate budget, two young people that tried to make it into the speech got removed before the speech had even started, because they just looked too activisty, I guess. They thought they were going to disrupt, they thought they were going to be a problem, so they just removed them. And the same can be said for during the World Leaders Summit, observers couldn't get in. They said it was because of COVID, but obviously, you know, I get it was also probably because of it was a bit of a security threat, but it's also that they don't want activists and civil society disrupting. They don't want activists and civil society showing up world leaders on such a scale. So that was a disappointment that we couldn't access that.
It's like the world leaders, it should even have a protest inside the negotiation space, you had to have it signed off beforehand. And I think that's quite telling, that they almost want to sanitize civil society. They want it to be palatable. They want it to not tell them inconvenient truths. And that's really not the way we're going to progress. It's denying the truth. It's more delayism, and it's not going to stop climate change at the end of the day.
Exactly.
I think also talking about the way they look to activism, we were having these discussions before the COP about what will we wear into the COP space, how formal to dress. And that is, I think, an interesting conversation in itself, is if you don't look the right part, then you're not going to be welcome to these discussions, because you're not expected to resonate the right ideology. You're not expected to resonate the right solutions. These solutions they come up with are very much within the framework in which we've been working with for the past 500 years. What we talked earlier, talking about, we still want to keep this global capitalist system going. We still want to keep developed nations above developing nations on these key metrics such as wealth. And they sanitize what they do and don't see, and do and don't hear.
Yeah. Hear. Couldn't have put it better.
Just a reason to be louder. Because outside of the space, civil society, anybody can join at the end of the day. And that's why I think it will always be the more radical voice, and it's why it will always be pulling and pushing.
Yeah, exactly. So talking about kind of the stuff going on outside the space, what was your kind of personal highlight from your experience? Because I know you were here, there, and everywhere, all around Glasgow. What was kind of one of your best moments?
There was a lot of good moments. I think I want to give a shout out to the COP26 coalition. The COP26 coalition was a grouping of civil society groups such as trade unions, NGOs, who don't always come together, but who had the common thread of demanding climate justice, and who wanted really to put on this display of, well, once organised as well, because we know we have to be well organised, but also put on this display of alternative ideas that wouldn't always be welcomed into the official space. So I'd say the People's Summit in general, which was an alternative conference they put on, full of workshops, talks, was a really, really good space to discuss a broad width of ideas to solve climate crisis that aren't always going into like the text and the negotiations. I think that was really eye-opening. Oh, that and the stickers. I got lots of stickers. Personal favourite, no pride on a dead planet.
I love it. I've got so many stickers. They're all up around my room now. I've already got some to like in my bag just to stick on lampposts wherever I go. Cats for community power. So many. Yeah, the People's Summit was so good. Like, I loved the movement assemblies. They had movement assemblies every day, which were focused on different topics, different issues within the climate change. And it was, yeah, these kind of groups that Josh was talking about, like trade unions, NGOs, all coming together, all discussing these issues. And they were so amazing, especially the one on climate debt and reparations. They're actually all up on YouTube if anyone wants to watch them. They're really interesting to listen to. Um, but my highlight was probably the People's March in the middle, because that was just so sick. That was the largest protest ever in Glasgow. Like, there was such an energy that day. There was so many people, even though it was pissing down with rain, and we were all soaked and we were all achy. But it was, yeah, just so cool to be part of that, like, really historic um, movement of people, and having been at the Fridays for Future march the day before, the speeches there were incredible, and yeah, just a really amazing, a very nice contrast from being in the blue zone, being in kind of the, very straight-laced talks, to them being on the at the with all the wonderful radical people that were in Glasgow. That was really cool.
Yeah, it was really exciting. Okay,
Yeah.
we've talked way over what I planned.
Not really.
I'd just like to say, Lucy has helpfully written a blog, which I think, have we uploaded it yet? Or it's coming out
Just about to in a bit,
today
yeah.
or tomorrow, which kind of summarises a lot what we were talking about, but we thought we'd talk through it. And also, I think over the next few weeks, we'll have more content coming out from a range of perspectives, hopefully, on what this outcome for COP means, what we'll be going to look forward to in the near future. So yeah, this is not the end, just another beginning.
Exactly.
Thanks for school. Thanks to anybody who watched. We are going to record this. In case you missed the start, we are going to record this, and it's going to be, captions are going to be added, and it's going to be uploaded as well. So
yeah,
cool. Anyway.
yeah. And hi again, Josh's mum. You have a wonderful son.
She's still watching.
Thanks for joining. Cheers. Thanks for joining, everyone. I'll see you soon, Josh.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.